971 5. 39715.
Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we once again sit in the parlor every week, challenging conventional thought.
With Colonel Mustard.
With the mustard.
Not the mustard.
It's the mustard. You know, now that I think of it, the parlor does have kind of a nice ring to it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It's a studio.
It's a studio. It's not a parlor anymore.
Just being in the parlor makes us sound more prestigious. No.
And well-read than we actually are.
No.
What? Are you offended? You look really triggered.
It's a studio. Triggered.
You said I wasn't well-read.
So we've got a few messages from listeners about some episode ideas, which is really awesome. The past few weeks, we've talked a lot about the case of Johnny Gosch and then about the Franklin scandal associated with it. And that, well, it was a good episode, but it wasn't great because it's sad and it's horrible. We got to dive into something a little closer to us as it was an Iowa case, and that was also pretty cool. It seemed like a lot of you were pretty interested in that, and we appreciate all of the support in the comments that we got when we were doing that little series. Any feedback that we received from you guys is genuinely appreciated. You have no idea how much we appreciate that. But as we are not primarily a true crime show, we must sadly move on. But it's only a little sadly because the show we have for you today is very, very interesting and terrifying in a different way.
There are a lot of really creepy aspects to this world. Some unquestionably real and some possibly, but maybe not. Everyone has a certain thing that freaks them out the most. For some, it's clowns. For others, it's spiders. For still others, it's people who sleep with their eyes open.
Ugh.
Okay, those are mine. Those are my things.
Those are my things.
I read about this years ago, and keep in mind, we are people who constantly seek out the deepest corners of the interwebs, trying to find stories that scare the hell out of us. And this, my friends, got us good. So you would think that we would stop. But alas, the mind is curious and the stories are endless, so we find ourselves engrossed in the subject time and time again. Well, what is it, you ask? And to that we say, we don't know. Many have just come to refer to them as the black-eyed children.
If you've never heard of this, then you are in for a treat.
Oh. Yeah, you are.
Whoa.
A treat indeed.
I don't know what noise I just made, but
whoa.
What are you talking?
We have something in store for you.
It will make you think twice about answering the door when a stranger is knocking, and 8 times about letting them in. Indeed. Don't let them in. It'll make you wonder why you get that eerie feeling that comes over you upon meeting certain people. Maybe it's not something that should be brushed off. Maybe our intuition is something that we should pay more attention to. Or listen to. Because it's easy to brush off a feeling like that, especially when you're speaking to a child. But maybe we shouldn't.
In comparison to other legends, the black-eyed children situation is a fairly newly reported phenomenon that has perpetuated thanks to the internet. Many state that Brian Bethel was the first to report them in an online ghost hunting chat room in 1998, 2 years after this claimed encounter. Brian Bethel's experience occurred in Abilene, Texas, while he was standing outside of a movie theater, using the light from the marquee to fill out his check and place it into the night deposit box for his internet company. He was approached at his car window by 2 boys. He estimated them to be around 9 and 12 years old, and he describes them as being an olive-skinned boy with curly hair and a pale freckled-skinned boy with red hair, both wearing hooded sweatshirts. They knocked at his car window. Brian cracked his window in order to see what they needed. The older boy began to speak, telling Brian that he had come to the theater to watch the premiere of Mortal Kombat.
Finish him.
But they had forgotten their money at home. They asked Brian if he would be willing to give them a ride to their mother's house to get their money and back to the theater. Bethel describes this odd feeling that he had from the moment he rolled down the window and the entire time these seemingly innocent-looking young men were speaking to him. A feeling of irrational dread and fear. He couldn't figure it out. This horrible, anxious uneasiness seemed out of place. The boys were polite and didn't seem threatening. They immediately seemed to sense this tension and began to reassure him, telling him that it won't take long, we're just 2 little kids. The tension remained with Brian as he tried to think of a way to get out of it and get rid of them politely. One of them tried to offer further reassurance, saying, "Come on, mister, we don't have a gun or anything." that would have been it for me.
Why would you say that? I'm not going to hurt you.
The way they spoke was weird, different. They were kind of socially awkward, and the things they were saying weren't really making a lot of sense. They were pushy, and something about them was just off. Subconsciously, Brian reached down slowly, never breaking his gaze with the older boy, and he started to open the door. Suddenly, their gaze broke, and he immediately noticed something odd about the boy. About both boys. They had something off about their eyes. Their eyes were pitch black. No whites, no irises, just black emptiness. The fear that he had been feeling grew stronger, but he tried to remain calm and keep his behavior normal. He didn't want them to know that he was afraid. He quickly gave them a few excuses and put the car in gear without waiting for a response, and he drove away. He immediately looked into his rearview mirror and noticed that the children had vanished within seconds into thin air.
There have been thousands of these claims of sightings and interactions with similar children since then, and the reports are coming in from all over the world. Though no one has offered any good physical evidence of their existence, the stories are no less creepy. Even though the first report of black-eyed children on the internet spawned in the late 90s, the stories did come up, but really just flew under the radar for a long time. It really wasn't until a 2-minute questionable video appeared on MSN's Weekly Strange, made it onto the entertainment section of the website in February of 2013 that the stories really began to draw attention. Now, it's common knowledge that once you read about something, you subconsciously become more attentive to it and may fall victim to a falsely perceived experience. This is why many people think that these stories have really gained in numbers over the past few years. Since most of these interactions with black-eyed children seem to be taking place at night, it's reasonable to think that their eyes might just be really dilated to adjust to the lack of light. Wrong. Various drugs can also do this, and coincidentally, make people act somewhat strangely.
So we've got 9-year-olds running around on LSD.
They're all on the marijuana. There is also the possibility that the internet stories caught on and caused people to create hoaxes using hoaxes.
Hoaxes?
I said it weird, like hoaxes. Hoaxes.
So angry.
And caused people to create hoaxes using sclera contact lenses in order to trick people into thinking that they are interacting with black-eyed children. It seems unlikely that this many people from totally different walks of life would be this mistaken, but who knows? As with every other phenomenon, there are a lot of theories as to what could be going on with the black-eyed children.
They're often described as being anywhere from toddlers to teenagers. Some will report them dressed in normal, modern clothing, and some will say that their clothing seems outdated or oddly fashioned. All report an overwhelming sense of fear that seems irrational and confusing at first, and their unnerving coal-black eyes that just seem extremely out of place. So much so that they typically slam the door in the face of a child asking for help, which is not exactly in line with innate human nature. They're typically reported as showing up in pairs or small groups asking to be let into your house or your car. Usually they need something, like a ride or to use your telephone or bathroom. Most reports indicate that there is something off about their speech as well, as though what they are saying has been rehearsed and well beyond their age. And in the face of their so-called emergency situation, they seem strangely calm and monotone. Almost all reports state that they decline the child entry into their car or house, and there are virtually zero reports of what happens if you let them in. But I got to thinking, what if there were people who let them in? Maybe we wouldn't know what happens because, let's face it, there's a lot of unexplained missing pokes in the world. It's a creepy thought.
So while most interactions end with the children denied entry and the children eventually moving on, and I say eventually because they often tend to linger around after being told that they cannot enter. Sometimes they wait a while and then come back, knocking again and asking the same exact oddly structured questions to the homeowner. I've even read a few stories about them being denied entry or simply being ignored and then moving on to knocking on windows, quietly still asking, "Can I please come in? I'm cold." Or, "Can I please come in and use your phone? I need to call my mother." Sometimes these visits occur at odd hours of the night, especially for young children, right? Who are these people?
That's what I'm
Letting
saying.
their kids run around at midnight?
At
I'm
my
gonna call
door.
your mama myself.
People offer to, and they're like,
kill
no,
me.
let me in the house. And then the men in black show up to pick them up.
Let me in. Either way, most people who report an experience don't let them in. You're so smart. You people are so smart. And almost all report that overwhelming feeling of fear and nervousness upon meeting them.
But browsing the internet, I did find one account of a woman who reports that she did allow these children into her home and now states that she is slowly dying as a result. This is what happens when you go against your better judgment. She searched the internet for similar stories to hers in order to try to rationalize what happened and found a collection on the Week in Weird website and decided to share hers. Here is her story.
Dun dun. My husband and I live just outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows one another and people don't lock their doors at night. There's never been a need to. There's always a need to. A little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small home on a dirt road just off the rural route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the nearby hills get very slippery in the snow, so I thought that someone might have been in an accident and broke down. It's happened before. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion spotlight was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from the road and into our driveway, but there was no car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road, and no one had driven on it for at least a couple hours. Our front door was obscured from the window, but I could see that someone was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I woke my husband up just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again, and my husband went to answer it while I stood in the hallway.
When he opened the door, there were two children standing in the snow looking toward the ground. They were a boy and a girl and could not have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely and had odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight. The boy had a dated haircut that looked almost like a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for winter, and my first thought was that they must have been Mennonite children, but as far as I know, there was never a large community of Mennonites near us. Thinking back on it, I know that my normal reaction to seeing children in a snowstorm would have been to rush them inside and bundle them up with some blankets and hot cocoa, but that is not how I felt. The children were very unnerving. They would not make eye contact, and when my husband asked them if everything was okay, they asked if they could come in. My husband looked at me like, "What do I do?" And I asked the kids where their parents were. "They'll be here soon," is all they said.
It was around 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, so the only reasonable thought in my head was that there must have been an accident or these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me not to bring them inside, I did anyway. I went into the kitchen to make some hot cocoa while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to the kids. He was asking them if they were okay, where they came from, how far they walked, if their parents' car was broke down, and things like that. But they always answered, "Our parents will be here soon." They spoke in a sing-songy voice. They weren't afraid to be in a stranger's home at all. I started to notice that our cats, we had 4, were all hiding except Pigeon, who was taken to the kitchen with me. Normally our cats are very curious and friendly, and we must be careful that they don't run out the door when we leave. This time, none of them even tried to see who was here, which I thought was very strange. The hair on Pigeon's neck was standing up, and his tail was puffed up while he looked in the living room. When I bent down to pet him to see what was wrong, he hissed and started growling and backed up until he hid himself under the kitchen island, and I've never seen him do that before. Trust the cats. If I give you no other advice in your life, trust the cats.
If your cat doesn't like it, you shouldn't either. When I walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch as still as can be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. I asked him what was wrong, and he just said that he felt really dizzy all of a sudden, but that he was fine. I turned back to the children and gave them their cocoa, but when they looked at me, I gasped. It took everything inside of me not to drop the mugs and run away. You should have dropped the mugs and run away. When they looked at me, their eyes were completely black. They had no whites, just giant black pupils. When they saw that I was scared, they stood up and they asked if they could use the bathroom. I tried to be as composed as I could be and showed them down the hall. They went to the bathroom together, and I hurried back to my husband to ask if he had seen their eyes. He had seen them too. He said that it looked like his brother's badly bruised eyes after a car accident. We were in the middle of talking about whose children they could be when my husband's nose started to bleed. He'd never had nosebleeds as long as I had known him. I just knew inside of myself that this had something to do with these kids in the bathroom, and I started crying while I ran to get my husband some tissues.
That's when the power went out.
That's when you nope out of there.
Nope. Right
Nope.
on out.
Nope to the car and drive away. Relinquish the home.
I heard my husband yell, relinquish the home.
It's over. I'm never going
It's
back.
over. Burn it.
Burn it down.
Kill it with fire.
Just let him have it. You can have it.
I heard my husband yell my name from the living room, and as I started to walk back through the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The 2 children were standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't moving, and I've never been so scared in my whole life. They just stood there, in the dark. After what felt like forever, the boy said, "Our parents are here." And they walked to the door, opened it, and walked out, leaving it wide open. My husband jumped up to go close it and almost fell over. We looked out the window and saw 2 men standing by a black car idling at the end of our driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black-colored suits and were very tall, at least 6 feet. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into the car, and drove off. Fare thee well. Why would you wave? What? Why would you wave?
I don't know. I would still be relinquishing the property.
Why am I waving? I don't know what to do with my hands. Oh. Anyway.
I feel like once you make my nosebleed, manners are out the window.
Right. So the power came on about a half hour later, but nothing was the same after that.
Over the next few months, 3 of our cats went missing. We can only assume that they ran away somewhere and never came back. But the worst thing was coming home to find Pigeon in a puddle of blood on the living room floor. He looked like he had been vomiting blood. The vet told us that he had some kind of hemorrhage. After my husband's nosebleeds became a regular occurrence, we went to see the doctor. He didn't know what to make of it other than dry nasal passages, but my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive skin cancer. When the doctor asked if he used tanning beds, we both thought he was joking, but apparently this kind of melanoma is linked to the overuse of indoor tanning. The doctors think that he will recover, but don't understand how it got so bad so quickly. My husband has never worked an outdoor job and spends relatively little time in the sun.
Since we let the black-eyed kids inside our home, I have also suffered from regular dizzy spells and nosebleeds on a regular basis. I've had other issues which I won't mention here, but trust me when I say that I am suddenly in the worst condition of my life and no one can do anything about it. I know that all of this is because I let the black-eyed children into my home. We've told everyone we could about the strange kids that showed up that night, but no one else saw them, and some laugh at how scared we were of the Mennonite kids. But we knew what we saw. I wish my husband had never opened the door. If you should ever encounter them, my advice would be to lock your doors, call the police, and wait for morning. Don't make the same mistake that I did.
Batten down the hatches, boys. So a theory emerged from this story that seemed to be somewhat commonplace among people who speculate as to what these beings could be. The appearance of the 2 tall men who arrived to gather these children bear an obvious semblance to the reported Men in Black encounters, which leads some to believe that there is an extraterrestrial link. The melanoma diagnosis that turns up shortly after the encounter is associated with moonburn syndrome that is commonly suffered after some people report a UFO encounter. These associations lead people to believe that the black-eyed children are a new trend of extraterrestrial contactee cases, as though extraterrestrials have changed their antics, thinking that this is a more subtle way to interact with human beings, for whatever reason. Maybe they're playing on our innate feeling that children are innocent and that we are typically willing to help them, gaining them easier access and a more open human host. The more I read these stories, it seems like the most popular theory among people. I will agree that there seems to be deep parallels to the Men in Black reports.
They both seem to show up in the evening hours, often late into the night. They will knock on your door and ask to be allowed into your home or vehicle under innocent circumstances, but never do you hear of them forcing their way in or entering unannounced without your permission. This almost gives them a vampiric effect as well, I think. But you know me. I likes my vamps. I won't pretend to know what these beings are by any means, but let's not forget, lest we not forget, that there is a place for this type of behavior in ancient demonology texts as well. Yes, it's called hell. It's called hell. Often demonic or evil entities cannot enter a person's home or body without some type of opening or invitation, even if the invitation is slight or unintentional.
So a hard no is what you need.
Hard no.
Hard no.
Hard no. Cannot confirm.
If they insist, then take them to the end of the laneway.
Don't come up the property.
Every time.
Every time. Fight me. Just put up your dicks.
Back to the Men in Black comparison of the black-eyed children. In sightings of both, the people are said to behave strangely. It's as though they are trying to act as normal as possible, but maybe imitating human behavior just isn't that easy if you aren't human. They often wear somewhat concealing clothing or accessories, hoodies, glasses, or hats. Often the Men in Black are reported to wear very thick wraparound sunglasses. Could they be catching on to our suspicions and the differences that we see from that of regular humans, particularly in their eyes? Perhaps they are one and the same, with different jobs to perform, with different types of interaction with humans.
The thing that makes me the most nervous is the fact that they are so persistent. They will knock on your door and ask several times to be let in, despite polite objections. If they ask first to use your telephone and you say no, then they may switch it up and ask if they can come inside to use the restroom or to get warm until their parents arrive. Many reports state that after the door is closed, the children will stand outside, staring at your house, and then approach and knock again and again. Other reports have the children moving to windows and walls.
To the windows!
To the walls!
We shan't
Till
go
you
further.
bleed out your nose and crawl.
That was poorly written.
That was, you know I can't not say it.
I set that up completely. Studio dog looks real concerned about what we got going on over here.
Other reports have the children moving to windows and walls, asking with muffled voices from outside, "Can we please come in?" over and over for extensive periods of time. Although they are eerily persistent, they are also very polite, using words like sir or ma'am when speaking to you. They also seem oddly educated for their ages, using very articulate and concise language. But often, although polite and concise, they sometimes seem to only know a few phrases like, "We need to use your telephone," or "Our parents are coming soon." My name is Inigo Montoya.
Every time.
Every time.
Give it up,
You
Princess
killed my
Bride.
father. Prepare to die.
My father?
My father. You killed my father. Hello, mother.
Every time you say that, I think of a cat with big giant cat eyes like Puss in Boots.
I love cats.
She does love cats.
Trust the cats. Our parents are coming soon. And no matter what they are asked, they will respond with one of these few phrases, even if it's not an appropriate answer. Sometimes they will replace words with severely outdated words. For example, instead of asking to use the telephone, they will ask to use the telegraph. Sometimes the police are called, only for these unnerving children to disappear without a trace right before the authorities arrive. Some people report them several times over, and some never see them again after an encounter. Since there are so few reports from people that have let them in or interacted with them for extensive periods of time, due to the feelings that they inspire within people, it's difficult to say what their intentions are, murder, if they aren't human.
It's alleged that they have some sort of psychic or telepathic abilities. Some witnesses report that the children will often stare at each other silently for long periods of time as if in deep communication with one another.
Allegedly.
They seem to be able to manipulate your emotions, making you fearful and panicked as if to intimidate you into letting them in. Simultaneously, you feel hypnotically drawn to them and compelled to open the door against your better judgment. I feel like there's a lot of next morning stories like that.
Morning after tales.
Mm-hmm. Flickering lights and power outages often accompany the children's visits.
It sounds like your kids at my house.
The Damons are here.
My name's Kyle, and I'm going to punch in your drywall.
Setting an even more ominous tone, like something straight out of a horror film.
A man named David Weatherly, who is an author, researcher, and cryptozoologist, has written a book about black-eyed children and has done extensive research into these reports and stories in order to try to find an answer. David was interviewed on the Tracy Austin Show with another author and cryptozoologist, Nick Redfern. They discuss several possibilities for explanations. David mentions the jinn, which is a popular legend of Middle Eastern culture seen mentioned throughout the Quran. The jinn are known to be master shapeshifters and exist in a parallel world to our own. They can be good or evil, and in Western culture are known as the genie and have been depicted in popular culture as somewhat silly and lighthearted in nature. For example, Aladdin's genie, I Dream of Genie, and Shaquille O'Neal's depiction in the 1990 film Kazan. Was that a movie, though?
Yeah, it gets mistaken because people think that it's that Mandela effect thing. People think that it's Sinbad. Sinbad.
But this is not the way that they are always shown historically. In other parts of the world, especially the Middle East, the jinn are tangible entities as much as humans are and have a much more sinister undertone. They are often thought to be the cause of many disappearances and are known to try to lure people where they need them or to innocently enter their homes. What better way to do this than under the guise of an innocent child? Innocent. I'm innocent.
So, of course, I took to the internet to see if I could find any stories from regular people who had a story to tell. I was looking mostly for earlier accounts of the black-eyed children since the phenomenon seemed to begin on the internet in the 90s. I wondered if there were, in fact, other reports out there that might have not been associated previously. This is what I got. One of the earliest reports seems to be from 1950 in Virginia. So the fact that this one is from the 50s makes me think that it isn't as new of a phenomenon as we think, but maybe just less common and more underreported. Maybe Brian Bethel's account being put up on the internet under a popular chat full of people looking for things of this nature just perpetuated this story faster and encouraged others with similar experiences to tell theirs as well. Author David Weatherly had researched this claim from the 1950s too.
16-year-old Harold was walking home when he came upon another boy leaning against a fence. Harold tried to make friendly conversation with him and received no response, so he turned to walk away. As Harold was about to leave, the boy looked at him and said flatly, "I want to go to your house. You're going to walk me up to your house." Harold looked at him a little closer, as if trying to figure out if he knew the boy from somewhere, and that's when he noticed his eyes. No white, just black as can be and completely unnatural. A surge of fear washed over Harold, and in that moment he found himself fighting the urge to turn and run as fast as he could. Don't fight the urge. Don't fight.
Do the running thing.
It was as though the boy knew what Harold was thinking, and he suddenly looked directly at Harold and said, "Now don't you run away from me. You're going to walk me up to your house." And Harold ran. In doing so, remembered hearing a loud scream behind him that sounded similar to that of a bobcat. Unlike many others, Harold's parents believed him, and his father grabbed his gun to go out looking for this kid who scared his son so badly. His mother believed him to have had an interaction with the devil himself and took Harold immediately to see a local priest.
Have you ever heard a bobcat scream?
Yeah, I used to hear them out at your house, and you'd want to run into the woods because it sounded like babies crying.
Well, they'd make it sound like babies crying, like an infant. But they also make it sound like, it sounds like a woman.
Murdered.
It sounds like a woman screaming. It is horrible. If you're sitting outside in the woods at night and you hear that, it is terrifying.
Have you ever seen the movie 30 Days of Night?
Yes.
The vampires screaming?
It is awful.
It is. It's that.
Those are my... I think
those are the scariest vampires.
They are. They did so good. They were the scariest vampires.
The scariest.
Like, their 30 Days of Night is the scariest vampire movie. But Lost Boys is the best one. I don't care what anyone says.
Edgar and Allan Frog.
That's right. If you don't have the Frog Brothers, you are nothing.
Hashtag the Coreys.
I don't know, because the Lost Boys 2 had the Frog Brothers, and did you see it?
Yeah.
It was
the first Lost Boys was the best one.
It was the only one as far as I'm concerned. The other ones didn't even have. Weatherly also even associated the black-eyed children, or being phenomenon, to a statue found at the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe. If you haven't heard of Göbekli Tepe, it's definitely something that you should look into because it is a very interesting site. We may have to do an episode on this in the future. Anyway, the statue is called the Urfa Man, and he's pretty popular out there with people who are interested in this type of thing. He is a statue that was carved about 13,500 years ago, and he's a humanoid figure. So the weird thing about this is that if you look at most statues carved throughout history, they're just carved out of one kind of stone. Whoever carved the Urfa Man took the time to gather obsidian and carve solid black eyes for this statue. The Urfa Man has always been reported to give people bad vibes whenever they are in his presence. The existence of the Urfa Man leads Weatherly to believe that the black-eyed people have been visiting us for a long time, and that it's more of an alien presence.
So the fact that the black-eyed people in Japanese culture are depicted as more of a supernatural entity, I think, could be just a misinterpretation. Maybe these creatures are alien, and the ancient people didn't really know how to describe them. Maybe the irrational fear that they felt due to the presence and the creep factor that they produced just led them to assume that was a maleficent spirit or demonic entity, and that is what led them to depict them this way in film, when really it was more of an alien situation.
So I also found one other story that was found by David Weatherly that came from France and was dated 1974. Apparently, he got this story from NICAP, which is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, for those who aren't familiar. According to Weatherly, there were two men driving along in a small village. Their names were Elaine and Patrick. It sounds like they were just kind of taking a drive in the country on a nice day with no particular destination in mind. And on this afternoon, they took a different route than normal. At one point, one of them noticed 5 figures in the courtyard of a house at the edge of the village. It's described on jimharold.com that 3 of the figures were standing aside in the yard, while another one was tracing its hands along the house. Another figure was standing out in the yard staring directly at the passing car containing the 2 men. One of the men rolled down their window and saw the figure up close, stating that his blood ran cold when he saw his face. The strangeness of their behavior, appearance, and just the general way that they moved was already disheartening. The figures were only about 4 feet tall with long hair, and they were all dressed alike, wearing robes that had multicolored spots. They described their eyes as solid black hemispheres, the size of billiard balls.
Immediately, the figure who had been staring at them started gesturing for them to come closer. This freaked them out so much that one of the men screamed out loud for the other to drive faster, as he felt the immediate need to get away from these creatures. Must go faster. They went back into town and told anyone who would listen. They then returned to the house to find no sign of the figures that they had both just witnessed. They did, however, find one neighbor who claims to have witnessed the entire thing as well.
This story is a little different, but we felt it necessary to include it here because there are actually many stories of black-eyed beings that don't always fit the actual description of black-eyed children, but they do have similar characteristics. Odd behavior, among other things that make me wonder if they aren't somehow connected. Are they some sort of alien hybrid? You hear all kinds of abduction stories about males who are forced to mate with female alien beings, and it's said that the purpose of this is for them to bear children who are the best of both worlds. Is that what's going on here? Are these children being used to more easily gain access to humans on a more personal level? If so, then why? What is the purpose of this? It would explain why they act so strangely. Someone who has simply studied humanity may understand some of the inner workings such as fashion and behavior, but would not be perfect at actually imitating it. Who knows? This is just one of the theories that's brought up in the many sources of thought-up information regarding this phenomenon, but it is the one that we find the most interesting. Well, I do. Especially due to the similarities to what is reported of the men in black who tend to visit after a reported abduction. People report the same disturbing behavior and sense of impending doom, and also report that they felt that they were somehow being controlled telepathically by them after an encounter.
David Weatherly has even claimed to have dug up stories of black-eyed children dating back to ancient China. Apparently, there were many stories of a black-eyed girl who had died and would haunt villages due to her anger associated with a traumatic and untimely death. So, this sounds much more like a supernatural situation, obviously, than an alien one. You also notice a lot of older Chinese and Japanese movies depict demonic or ghostly apparitions to have entirely black eyes, as well as this is a thing of their lore.
In the United Kingdom, there's an area known as Cannock Chase that has been very well known for a wide spectral sightings as far back as the 60s. It seems to be somewhat of a hotspot, kind of similar to things that we hear about Skinwalker Ranch and other places here in America. The sightings here have brought about a new and much more sad theory about the black-eyed children. Aside from supposed hauntings, Cannock Chase has a very dark and very real history. In the 60s, a car mechanic by the name of Raymond Morris was convicted of the abduction and murder of 3 very young girls, which he buried on Cannock Chase. This has perpetuated some theories that the black-eyed children are spirits of the children who have been taken from the earth in horrific ways and have yet to rest and continue to seek assistance from others, possibly not realizing what has happened to them. Sightings of the black-eyed children at Cannock Chase don't really seem to be very frequent, with a couple reported in the 70s and several in the 80s before the reports seemed to stop cold until recently. The recent reports involve a woman walking at Cannock Chase with her daughter when they began to hear what sounded like a child screaming in the distance. She reports, "We instantly started running toward the noise. We couldn't find the child anywhere, and so we stopped to catch our breath. That's when I turned around and saw a girl standing beside me. no more than 10 years old, standing there with her hands covering her eyes, as if she was waiting for a birthday cake. That alone would make me just take off running like a scared little for real. Like just being in the woods and finding a small child covering her eyes like that, that's enough. I asked if she was okay and if she had been the one screaming. She put her arms down by her side and opened her eyes. That's when I saw that they were completely black. No iris, no white, nothing. I jumped back and I grabbed my daughter. When I looked again, the child was gone. It was so strange.
Shortly after this report, a man also came forward and told a similar story. He states, I was following my usual route when I started to hear something rustling in the bushes. Presuming it was a squirrel or something similar, I carried on walking for around another 10 minutes. However, the noise seemed to follow me. After walking down a small path with trees on either side, the noise started to come from a different direction. It seemed to be directly behind me. To my amazement, standing behind me was a small child, no older than 10, with her hands raised over her eyes. My dog started barking frantically, and I was asking the girl if she was okay. She didn't respond. I was feeling a little disturbed, so I began to walk away. Suddenly, she appeared again in front of me, this time with her hands down at her sides. I almost fell over when I noticed her eyes were jet black. Again, my dog went mental. This time, he was pulling me in the opposite direction. I looked down at my dog for an instant, and in the blink of an eye, the girl was gone. This man said that he had told the story of what happened on his walk to some friends and family who laughed it off, and even kind of made fun of him for being so freaked out about it. Then they saw the news coverage of the other report this week. Apparently, the new sightings have sparked a lot of fear in the residents of Cannock. So much so that some have considered leaving and have posted online that they're too scared to leave their homes, especially at night.
So there we are. This type of encounter isn't the most widely reported, but it is reported enough in different areas of the world and in different time periods who seem to have such similar depictions that I think this trend is definitely something strange and something to think about. Feel free to look more into this phenomenon yourself, but be sure not to make the same mistake I did by reading through these many stories at night, because I promise you, you won't sleep.
So that's it for this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you have found some enjoyment in this week's episode. Never sleep again. I have to take the time to mention again David Weatherly's book, The Black-Eyed Children. If you have any interest in this subject, he and his co-author Nick Redfern seem to us to be the most researched people on the subject, and their book is full of stories and theories that will really make you think and cry and hide under the blanket and not answer your door and hide from the FedEx guy.
I already hide from the FedEx guy. Is
right?
that terrible?
No.
So I hear my dogs bark and I'm like,
tuck and roll.
Like my instant feeling isn't, let's go see who it is. It's hide. I even make my kids hide.
You can find it on Amazon. So give that a read and see what you can take away from it. Also, you will hide from the guy who delivers it to you. Also, there are several good interviews with them out there, but my favorite is their interview with Jim Harold for the Paranormal Podcast. It's one of my favorite shows, and if you have any interest in anything paranormal or just strange in general, give Jim Harold a listen because he has been one of our personal favorites for a long, long time.
Don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever platform you choose to listen from. And if you've been listening and you haven't already, don't forget to pop over to the ratings and comments section and leave us a review. It only takes a few seconds to do it, and it's immensely helpful to us, and we would appreciate it very much. Check out our various sources for more in-depth information.
Hit us up on the Facebook.
If you have a pertinent story. It can be anything weird, really.
To the window. To the wall.
Either way. We would love to hear from you and love for you to visit.
Let us in.
Once again, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.
I need to call my mom.
I want to use your bathroom. I want a hot dog.
I need some soup.